Boris Johnson says he welcomes a police investigation into gatherings held in Downing Street and Whitehall during lockdown. It comes after details were passed from the senior civil servant conducting her own inquiry to the police.
The Met is now investigating a number of events that took place at Downing Street and Whitehall in the last 2 years.
Downing Street said that Boris Johnson didn't think he'd broken the law.
I welcome the Met's decision to conduct its own investigation because I believe this will help to give the public the clarity it needs and help to draw a line under matters.
But the Prime Minister faces pressure from the police, from his own party and from an official inquiry, which could emerge as early as tomorrow.
Also on the programme tonight. A plane with US military equipment arrives in Ukraine to help bolster defences as tension with Russia continues to rise. The pandemic's toll on frontline staff and the nurse who's so burnt out she's moved to the other side of the world. And the man trapped underground for over 50 hours when caving in the Brecon Beacons returns to thank his rescuers.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News Channel, Roy to the rescue. Hodgson replaces Ranieri as Watford appoint the former England boss in a bid to stave off relegation.
Good evening. Downing Street and Whitehall find themselves the subject of police investigation tonight after the Met said it was now looking into the claims of multiple parties there during lockdown, potentially breaking COVID rules. Boris Johnson, who's been under severe political pressure over the allegations, welcomed the decision, saying he's willing to speak to detectives and that he hopes it'll draw a line under the matter. The head of the Metropolitan Force, Dame Cressida Dick, said the police moved in after they were passed information uncovered by the civil servant Sue Gray in the course of her inquiry into possible lockdown breaches in government. Number 10 hasn't yet received a copy of her report, but it could be published as early as tomorrow. Here's our political editor, Laura Kunsberg.
The law applies in every town, every city, every road and every house, and in the SW1 postcode of number 10. And the police have concluded they've seen enough about what happened behind closed doors when the law was locked down, that it merits a full and proper look.
I can confirm that the Met is now investigating a number of events that took place at Downing Street and Whitehall in the last 2 years.
So for only the second time in a century,
can you survive the police investigation, Boris Johnson?
A serving Prime Minister will be investigated for what happened under his own roof. After months and months of claims about rule-breaking during a national emergency.
The Prime Minister.
I believe this will help to give the public the clarity it needs and help to draw a line under matters. But I want to reassure the House, Mr. Speaker, and the country that I and the whole government are focused 100% on dealing with the people's priorities.
I'm told the police have been talking to the official who's been trying to get to the bottom of what happened for weeks. And enough evidence about gatherings or parties in Downing Street is there for them to contemplate prosecutions.
Was it right to have a birthday gathering in Downing Street, Miss Stories?
More than a dozen events, including a celebration and cake around the cabinet table for the Prime Minister's birthday, have emerged.
Will there be cake on the cabinet table today, Miss Truss?
But when ministers were there, around that same table this morning, Boris Johnson made no mention of the police investigation he already had been told about. Those loyal to him have been louder in recent days.
The vaccine rollout, the furlough programme, the economy having bounced back to pre-pandemic levels. The leadership of Boris Johnson this country has been so brilliant.
But even before the police or official report, there have been plenty of private Tory recriminations for the chaos.
I've not been invited to any parties.
All of it more fuel for the opposition parties.
So it seems, Mr. Speaker, potential criminality has been found in Downing Street. What a truly damning reflection on our nation's very highest office.
We cannot go on with this chaotic government. Will he advise his boss to do the right thing in the national interest and resign?
Can we please have a sense of proportion over the Prime Minister being given
a piece of cake in his own office by his own staff.
The timing and complexities of a police investigation could slow down the Tory party's rush to judgment on Boris Johnson. Conversations among MPs over there who have the power to determine his future may be put on pause. Yet one former minister said there is no universe where a police investigation into Downing Street is a good thing in the real world. The Tories, who like to be seen as the party of law and order, are facing serious political disorder of their own. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
So what will the police be considering and why didn't they act sooner? Our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Sanford reports.
For months, arguments around alleged parties in Downing Street and its garden have swept through Whitehall, while London's main police force has kept quiet, saying only that it was in touch with Sue Gray, who's leading the Cabinet Office investigation. So why is the Met investigating now? Well, this morning, the Commissioner said 3 key factors would lead to them looking into COVID rule breaches that happened many months ago.
My 3 factors were and are: there was evidence that those involved knew or ought to have known that what they were doing was an offence. We're not investigating would significantly undermine the legitimacy of the law, and where there was little ambiguity around the absence of any reasonable defence.
And what will the police look at? The starting point will be what Sue Gray has already uncovered.
The investigation itself should be reasonably straightforward. Now police have decided which of the events at Downing Street was potentially illegal. They'll just need to try and work out who was at each one, and they'll do that by looking at emails, at personal accounts and at movements on staff passes. And they'll also need to check whether anyone had a legitimate reason to be at any of the events.
For some opposition politicians, the question is, why did police not act sooner? Did the officers who work in Downing Street every day not notice the events when they were happening?
It sounds like there was a culture of law-breaking parties rather than a single one-off event. We've heard reports of wheelie suitcases of drink clanking through security. Surely some officers were concerned about what they were seeing at the time.
So you'll be aware that there are a number of officers posted in the surrounds of Downing Street. The ones you see are all armed and they have a job to do.
Last March in this Warwickshire garden, Kieran McArdle and 3 friends had a small birthday party. The police arrived within the hour and fined him. He wants Whitehall partygoers to face the same punishment.
When the story of these parties are coming out now, it's a little bit galling when you see that the people that made the rules are breaking the rules and they're not being held to account.
So what are the potential punishments? Well, anyone who attended an illegal gathering in Downing Street during lockdown faces a fine, from £60 if it was near the start of the pandemic to £200 if it was more recently. It's not clear if the Prime Minister is one of those who faces a possible fine. Daniel Sanford, BBC News, Downing Street.
And we can get the latest from Laura at Westminster now. Laura, after weeks of the Prime Minister being under pressure, an extraordinary development today.
Yes, Rita, I mean, extraordinary is often an overused word around these parts, but it genuinely is extraordinary for a serving Prime Minister to be part of an active police investigation. It's only the second time it's happened in a century. And while earlier today there were some backers of Boris Johnson who felt, well, perhaps this might slow down what has been a terrible crescendo for Number 10, in actual fact, the optics of police being involved in this are deeply, deeply serious. And then when it comes to the official inquiry that will be the civil service verdict on everything that went on behind closed doors during lockdown, well, I'm told that the report is complete. Sue Gray, the official, is basically done, even though Number 10 is yet to receive their official copy. And I'm also told that it will not be easy reading, either for ministers in government or indeed for members of the civil service themselves. I'm also told that Sue Gray very much wants the full contents of the report to be out there in
the full public glare. That could happen as early as late tomorrow. It may yet tip into Thursday while every I is dotted and every T is crossed. No official confirmation of any of that from Downing Street today, but there certainly is a real sense of nervous anticipation for two reasons. Number one, this matters hugely because in the last few weeks, Tory MPs have really genuinely and seriously been discussing whether it might be time to call a halt to Boris Johnson's leadership. Not the view of everyone, but there are certainly people who've been organising to try to make that the case, and the Sue Gray report may be the decision moment for many of them. And secondly, because from a political point of view, in terms of the public's view, it's been so toxic for many MPs who've heard from their constituents and many ministers too, because it's really pressed at a bruise. The idea that people in this square mile in government were not following the rules that they set for millions of people during lockdown, which caused such suffering and such hardship for so many. These genuinely are, in the next 24 to 48 hours, Rita, decisive days for Boris Johnson.
Laura, many thanks. Laura Kunsberg there reporting from Westminster. The Prime Minister has said that Britain is prepared to deploy troops to protect NATO allies in Europe should Russia invade Ukraine. Boris Johnson said that Vladimir Putin would face ferocious Ukrainian resistance. And tonight, President Biden said that he'd consider personal sanctions on Mr. Putin if there were a Russian invasion. Our diplomatic correspondent Caroline Hawley reports.
The might of the Russian army on display in its ally Belarus, Ukraine's northern neighbour, where military exercises are planned next month. Moscow has been building up troops on Ukraine's eastern border too, and fears of a new war in Europe are growing. The Kremlin is still denying it'll invade, President Putin keeping the world guessing about what his intentions really are.
If Russia invades Ukraine, we would look to contribute to any new NATO deployments to protect our allies in Europe. But if President Putin were to choose the path of bloodshed and destruction, he must realise that it would be both tragic and futile.
Russia's now amassed around 100,000 troops near its border with Ukraine, leading to huge international concern. Moscow used to control much of the region, but many countries have since joined NATO, the military alliance of European and North American countries of which the UK is also a part. And President Putin has demanded that Ukraine never be allowed to join NATO. So the West is now ramping up its response, the defensive counter-build-up growing by the day. Warships and fighter jets from several NATO members are now heading to Eastern Europe. This is American military equipment and munitions arriving in Kiev. It's being called lethal aid. The US has now put 8,500 troops on alert to deploy at short notice if they need to. Russia's also being threatened with unprecedented economic sanctions, which could target President Putin himself, the US says, if he does give the order to invade.
For Russia, not only in terms of economic consequences and political consequences, but it will be enormous consequences worldwide. This would be the largest, if he were to move in with all those forces, it would be the largest invasion since World War II. It would change the world.
Some in Ukraine think the West is being alarmist. Others are growing increasingly nervous.
We have to stick together because we have enemies. Our big neighbour, Russia, it is like a cancer on our soil.
Moscow today accused the Americans of whipping up tensions over Ukraine, but suggested that diplomacy isn't dead yet. Caroline Hawley, BBC News.
There's growing concern over staff shortages in the NHS in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. The latest survey from the Royal College of Nursing shows that more than half of staff are considering leaving the profession. Exhaustion is one of the key reasons. In the second of his special reports from the Royal London Hospital, Clive Myrie looks now at the mental toll on frontline staff.
How far would you go to find your humanity?
Was just really struggling with the whole culmination of, what we were going through, and it felt like every shift I was going to work, we were having to open more beds, and we were seeing more people that, were really, really sick with COVID.
Now, former NHS senior sister Becky Smith is in Australia, her faith in herself restored. I first met her on the main COVID ward of the Royal London Hospital during the first wave.
Potentially we'll make a decision about whether it's appropriate to continue with what we're doing at the moment.
Among her duties was telling families there was no hope for their sick relative. Then she'd switch off their life support machine. Becky would always stay with the patient, just for a few moments, behind the partition, as life passed to death, holding their hand in respect. Then one day, with 2 COVID patients, after several deaths over many months, she quietly snapped.
It was just robotic. I turned off the ventilator, I walked away, and I remember just thinking to myself, my gosh, what am I doing? Total compassion fatigue, total emotional burnout. I'm sure it would break the hearts of those families to know that that's kind of the mentality that I had at that time.
Most outsiders will never understand the mental grind of the last 18 months for those charged with healing us all.
I run just to clear my head, really. I think the last couple of years have been pretty challenging, at times very, very stressful, and running has been a good release valve for that.
For consultant PJ Zolfagari, this is what he means by challenging and stressful.
Yeah, okay, ready, steady, go.
Multiple life and death decisions day after day during the COVID pandemic.
This guy's not going to survive the night. We'll have to call the family, I think.
From the ankles. Oh, right, okay, yeah, I can see they're very, very swollen.
Now things are calmer, but for how long? The waiting list of 12 months or more for a procedure has grown from less than a dozen to 4,500 because of the pandemic. This man has a heart condition. PJ, his case, of course, a reminder that the NHS has so many other things to deal with, not just COVID.
I think we do now need to concentrate on all the other illnesses and issues that people have.
So, no let-up for the NHS, even after the rigours of COVID. But how much more can staff take?
Can you handle another wave, if there's another variant?
Probably, I'd have to. You know, I think it would take a lot, and I think every wave leaves a bigger mark. But I would do my best. I'd try.
Dear Dad, thank you so much for making Christmas Day happen a week early.
Never mind the pressure on NHS staff. What about their families?
I'll be doing what I do best and caring for people who need me. Caroline, oh yeah, she looks a bit...
Pat and Nessa Kelly celebrated Christmas this year without their daughter Carleen.
It was hard, Carleen, going back this year.
She was on shift on December the 25th at the Royal London Hospital, 350 miles away.
I sent her a text message and said the tears are running down my face here. When she went away first, I missed her terribly. It took the light out of the house. Yeah. She's wonderful.
Ready, steady, turn.
This is Carleen, doing what she does best. Over the course of the coronavirus pandemic, we followed her progress as a nurse on the front line. Now she's a senior sister.
Morning.
Morning. How are you?
How to see you.
You too. You too.
It's a bit fresh though, isn't it?
I've no doubt all of us will suffer from some sort of PTSD. I look at empty bed spaces now, and I remember that person. I remember speaking to their family. I remember when they passed away.
People who've died.
Yeah. And I see them.
Those ghosts, do you think they will live with you forever?
I don't know.
How to banish those memories of trauma. Consultant Martin Griffiths, in an abandoned intensive care unit, reflects on the struggles, the past atmosphere of dread.
And you're here now, it just looks like an empty room, doesn't it? But I can feel it. And I don't want to go back to it.
Is it over?
It feels like we ended something. We're starting a new thing. But I don't want to live with the ghost. I want to put it to rest. I'm not sure we're going to do that just yet.
Clive Myrie, BBC News.
Well, the UK's latest coronavirus figures show that there were more than 94,000 new infections in the latest 24-hour period. It means there were just over 93,000 new cases on average per day in the last week. The number of people in hospital with COVID remains stable, currently just over 17,000. Another 439 deaths were reported. That's of people who died within 28 days of a positive test. On average, in the past week, there were 263 deaths per day. On vaccinations, nearly 37 million people have had a booster jab. That's just over 64% of those aged 12 and over. The UK economy will grow more slowly than expected this year as it recovers from the pandemic. That's according to the International Monetary Fund. Their forecast for Britain's growth in 2022 has been cut to 4.7% from 5%. This will still be the fastest in the G7 industrialised nations. Well, our economics editor Faisal Islam is here with me. Why has this happened, Faisal?
It's global factors driving this. The biggest forecast downgrade from the IMF was for the two big world economies, the US and China. The UK was only actually downgraded a modest amount and still, as you say, remains the fastest growing G7 economy this year as it was last year, though it should be said that's partly down to the fact that we rebounded from being the hardest hit in 2020. What's driving this? We have, of course, the impact of the Omicron wave, though that has been a little bit more modest than expected than previous waves, and also those rising energy prices. And on that, the IMF expressed concerns, as we've been hearing, about those tensions between Russia and Ukraine further increasing energy prices, but also gave some support to some thinking within government about the idea that the support required for ordinary consumers on their energy bills facing a £50 a month rise in April, that should be targeted and temporary. Some backbench MPs have jumped on public finance figures from this morning showing that borrowing was lower than expected to say that the national insurance rise should be delayed. IMF suggesting targeted, temporary on people's bills.
Faisal, many thanks. A 15-year-old schoolboy has been airlifted to hospital after being stabbed at Walney School in Barrow-in-Furness this morning. The pupil suffered multiple wounds but is now in a stable condition. Police say they've arrested a 16-year-old boy on suspicion of grievous bodily harm. Bradford Council is to be stripped of control of its children's services in the wake of the murder of 16-month-old Star Hobson. Social services were in contact with the family of the toddler before she was murdered by her mother's girlfriend in September 2020. 2 years earlier, the department was rated inadequate by Ofsted. An independent trust will now operate the department. The High Court has ruled that the government's National Disability Strategy, which was published in July and set out to improve the everyday lives of disabled people, is unlawful. It follows a failure to lawfully consult with disabled people and others. A government spokesperson has said it'll be seeking permission to appeal the decision at the Court of Appeal. The chairman of Middlesex County Cricket Club has apologised for comments he made today at a parliamentary hearing on tackling racism in the sport. Mike O'Farrell suggested that players from an African Caribbean background were more attracted to rugby and football, and that South Asian people sometimes preferred to focus on education rather than cricket. Our sports correspondent Joe Wilson reports.
English Cricket's South Asian Action Plan, one initiative the ECB was keen to highlight today in front of a select committee. But when it came to explaining the barriers to diversity in the professional game, the chair of Middlesex County Cricket Club said this.
The football and rugby world becomes much more attractive to the Afro-Caribbean community. And in terms of the South Asian community, there is a moment where we're finding that they do not want necessarily to commit the same time that is necessary to go to the next step, because they prefer, not always saying they do it, they sometimes prefer to go into other educational fields.
There was no response in the room. There was immediately on social media. Former international Ebony Rainford-Brent chairs the ACE Foundation to address declining black cricket participation. She reacted. These outdated views are exactly why we're in this position. Unfortunately, the decision makers hold on to these myths, i.e. that young black people like football, Asian community, only interested in education. Mike O'Farrell apologised for what he described as his lack of clarity. I was aiming to make the point that as a game, cricket has failed a generation of young cricketers, he said. Azim Rafiq accepted that apology, but with deep concerns.
I just feel like clearly the counties and the game are still very much in denial, and that's a big worry.
For the cricketer who experienced and exposed racism at Yorkshire, today's events revealed the long road still to travel. Joe Wilson, BBC News.
The man who spent more than 50 hours underground after being badly injured while caving in the Brecon Beacons has been back to meet some of the volunteers who saved his life. George Linnane fell last November and broke his leg, jaw and several ribs, leaving him in agony and wondering if he'd ever get out. More than 300 volunteers from around the UK joined the extraordinary rescue effort. Our correspondent Hal Griffith reports.
Little did I know it was going to turn into a 50, 60-hour epic, whatever it was, where, you know, I could have never come out of there again.
This is where George Linnane's life changed in an instant. Ogof Ffynnon-ddu, Britain's deepest cave system. Somewhere he'd been dozens of times before, but last year, deep underground, the rock beneath him crumbled and he fell into the darkness.
The first thing I knew about it was this instantaneous feeling of legs whirling around in midair and arms grabbing for something. You know, 1 second I was caving, the next minute the world went mad. And then it all went black, and then 2 minutes later I kind of woke up in a very different state to when I'd started.
George broke his leg, jaw and several ribs. He was bleeding heavily. As a friend went for help, he wrestled with the pain.
Did you think that you might not survive?
Honestly, yes, at times. It was kind of dark times initially, I guess, until the help started arriving.
What followed was Britain's longest ever cave rescue. In all, 300 volunteers from across the UK turned out to help. They included Becky, a doctor with a local rescue team, who was one of the first to help him.
My immediate thought was there's a chance that he's not going to survive this. And then the thought also went through my mind that I'm the only medical professional here, and that if he does become more unwell, that everyone's going to be looking to me to do something. So, yeah, it was a big weight of responsibility.
After 54 hours underground and being carried in a stretcher for 3,500 metres, this is the exit where George finally came to the surface. From here, he was transferred into a rescue vehicle, then into an ambulance, then onto hospital. But his journey to a full recovery is going to be a long one. George still faces months of treatment, but is determined to return to caving and become a rescue volunteer, joining the team which saved him. If there was a message you wanted to give them, the people who turned out and travelled to come and help you, what would it be?
I would just say thank you from the bottom of my heart, really, and I'd also let them know that the beer that I owe them is on the way. Yeah, it's in the pipeline.
Hywel Griffith, BBC News at Ogof Ffynnon-ddu.
Well, that's it from us. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a very good night. Bye-bye.